nomination form is actually pretty flexible, and you can organize it in a lot of different ways. And there have been some projects that have required being more creative about how to structure the narrative. And it actually does allow for that. There are different ways you can organize each criteria statement underneath the Section 8 heading. And the main key is to focus your arguments under the headings that you create. And that will help you identify exactly what it is that you're talking about in that area of significance and why that property is important. I try, as a result of doing that, it can help you to avoid redundancy and repetition because you focus your arguments to the specific heading. And also always go back to what is the resource you're talking about. There are a lot of tangential pieces of history that are really interesting and you can get really excited about, but if there's nothing there to tie it to, it's not really an essential part of the significance statement. And by doing that, I find that you can avoid being redundant and repetitive. And again, I repeat it, always come back to why, because that's the most important part. And as you're thinking about why something's important, you should always be questioning the reasons other people have come up with for why it's important. Question the kind of cliche statements, oh, well, it's a beautiful building, or it's the first, the best, the only. Maybe it's not. And when you start digging into it, sometimes you have to be more nuanced about why this particular building is important and what level it's important at. It depends on whether you're doing a locally significant or something that is important within the state, or properties with national significance, which I will touch on as well. And also remember to make it interesting and pleasant to read. The best feedback I've gotten has been when people have actually enjoyed reading our significance statements and find that rather than a slog through lots of details and dates and facts that don't really matter, I've had people come up at public meetings and say, what a pleasant read that was, you know, and it makes it much more likely that someone will actually pull it out of the file and read it when they're interested in the property. So I'm going to start with some relatively straightforward projects that I've worked on and note some of the things that might appear often in a National Register nomination. And then I'm going to move on to some more complex projects which I've done for the National Park Service, where these properties are clearly important at the national level but often have very layered histories and require a little bit more work to make the statement focused and concise. And they've also brought up some interesting conundrums that may also help guide other types of nominations. First one I'm going to talk about is a high school in Bourne, Massachusetts on the Cape. It was built in 1905 and it has a 1934 gym addition at the back. This National Register nomination was done for the town and it's locally significant. The question of why, it's pretty straightforward. In the area of education, it was associated with the town's public educational system, and it reflected a trend at the time it was built towards school consolidation in Massachusetts. And it's also locally significant for its architecture. It's a good example of a colonial revival high school. To develop the criteria statement for this was on the face of it very straightforward: education, architecture. The context for the education to really highlight why it was important, because it was one of the first in Massachusetts to introduce this consolidation trend. But really you have to establish what else was going on in the state and then in the town, and answer questions like, how many other schools were there, where, what type of schools? Question the number of students that were enrolled and the demographics that led to the construction of the building. How were the construction decisions made? How were they funded? And all of those pieces helped to really tighten the statement of making it very obvious right away why this school is worthy of being listed at the local level. And it was also important to bring up the discussion to the present, so you know all the changes to the building site and you could understand that it had integrity. The next nomination is one that we did for the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and it's Boston Fish Pier in Boston, built between 1910 and 1914, and it is still an active working fish pier. And the reason this is significant is It was Boston's primary fish processing and distribution facility for over 100 years, still functioning in that capacity. And Boston was the nation's leading producer and distributor of fresh fish through the mid-20th century, something I did not know until I looked into this project. It was therefore nationally significant in a variety of areas: industry, commerce, and maritime history. But all of those areas were very interrelated. And so the criteria statement that I did was one statement that covered all of those very intertwined areas of significance. And I needed to look at the context for why Boston was the leading producer and what else was going on in New England. And there are other important port cities in New England, obviously, and had to look at including the comparative information to really justify the national significance for this. And some of the obvious comparable locations were in New York City, Fulton Fish Market, which was also the oldest wholesale fish market, and it relocated in 2005. So it had an obvious comparison, but easy to distinguish why Boston's still working here. And for this particular resource, the architectural significance was a separate criteria statement that was only locally significant for the architecture. And so under that heading, made it very short and simple. Didn't include any other information, just the architectural significance, the biographical information on the architects, what else they've done, why they did it in the style that it was done. This is a very unique resource in Concord, New Hampshire, the Concord Gas Holder House, built in 1888 by the Concord Gas Light Company. Another National Register that was done for the town. Its function is a storage tank for purified manufactured coal. It was. And this resource was earlier determined eligible because it was part of a district in downtown Concord, where the gas complex was located, and it was a pretty intact district up until the early 90s. But the rest of the complex was then demolished. So what's left is this one building. And its significance, therefore, is really, it has its own independent national significance in engineering because it is the last intact gas holder that still has its gas holder house, or gas holder house and gas holder in the United States. And so the reason why was very clear, but the description really had to lay out a lot of the background and significance, and so that anyone reading it can understand why that matters. So it provided the background for the construction and use, what was going on, history of gas lighting, why the city wanted more gas manufactured, and why it made sense for a company to develop the way it did, the evolution of the technology, a lot of the changes that occurred within the complex and affected this particular structure, the conversion to natural gas that meant that it was no longer used after 1953, so it accounts for its condition today. And also particularly emphasized the role of gas holders in the manufactured gas industry. So because it is this unique, rare resource, also justifying national significance, I included information on other extant gas holders gas holders in houses, and there are 14 known extant houses, but none have their gas holders intact. And we did a lot of research looking at published sources, aerials, current aerials, current information about the buildings, and that was an important component of it. We left out a lot of extraneous information about the development of the area around the building, all of which was a very interesting story and part of Concord's story, but not as appropriate for why this particular building is important. And one different quality about this building's nomination was that where the other two that I talked about had periods of significance that continued up to the 50-year cutoff. They were, these properties are still in use, and their significance basically continues to the usual 50-year cutoff. What we did for the gas holder was its primary significance under engineering is just for that what it was constructed and used for. And this one, so the period of significance was just 1 year, 1888, the year it was completed and entered active use. Trying to figure out what, other points where its use changed. It's really significant for its construction. one is Polly Hill Arboretum, which is in West Tisbury, Massachusetts, on Martha's Vineyard. It's a great little site. It's typical Martha's Vineyard colonial era buildings, circa 1750 house on the left, and it's on a beautiful landscape site. And the National Register for this was done for the property owner, which is the Polly Hill Arboretum. It's a public arboretum now. And it's locally significant. And its significance is basically split into 3 different periods. It's significant as a farm for agriculture. It's significant for its conservation as a summer retreat in the 19th and early 20th century. And the woman Polly Hill who developed it as an arboretum. And it's significant for its colonial architecture. It has this long 300-year history, and we had to look very closely at how the landscape had changed over that time and figure out where the resources that are there actually relate to the significance as an agricultural property, and also other resources relate to the era of its conservation by Polly Hill's family. And then we went up to 1965, even though it's still in use, a lot of it, the later alterations, they didn't meet criteria consideration G for exceptionally significant, but the property's local significance as this long evolution of its history was clearly explained in the other criteria statements. So, now those were some of the more straightforward projects that I worked on where there is a clear significance at the beginning. Going to switch to some National Park Service projects that I've worked on, and as Marina mentioned, George Washington slept a lot of places, especially in the National Park Service. And this is the first. This is where George Washington was born. However, it's really not. It's a reconstruction of the house where George Washington was born in Colonial Beach, Virginia. And the National Park Service projects, they often require a different organization to really explain the history of the property, why it maybe entered the National Park Service, and its history since that time. And this one really brought up some interesting conundrums because of its complex history. It's 550 acres on the Potomac River, a portion of the plantation that was owned by George Washington's father when he was born in 1732. So it's important. Why? Because it's associated with the Washington family ownership. It's also associated with the efforts to preserve and commemorate the site in the late 19th and early 20th century, which the memorial house here was built in 1931. The reconstruction of this house was based on the location of the chimney stack that in the 19th century was believed to be the birthplace house. And over time, throughout the 19th century, there was an obelisk built on the site of the foundations, and then the obelisk was moved, so this memorial house that was based on a lot of conjecture, a lot of images that people thought it looked like, but nothing that was definitively documented, so that it could be built in 1931. Around the time the house was built, the National Park Service hired other archaeologists to do more work on the site, and they discovered another set of foundations nearby that they called Building X, and after doing more work and more research, discovered that they were wrong initially. Where the memorial house was built was probably an outbuilding or a kitchen, and the Building X foundations were the location of George Washington's birthplace. So in looking at how to craft this nomination, which had multiple periods of significance for resources from the 18th century all the way up to the 20th century, various criteria considerations had to be considered for commemoration and the fact that we're nominating a birthplace. And there were a lot of areas of significance. So because you don't have to put them in any particular order, we started with criterion B, and George Washington, who was he? Why do we care about him? And how exactly was he associated with this property? Then we explained under conservation why the property was important, its story of how it was preserved, who was involved, all of which relate to a lot of other trends across the country, and then culminating with the construction of this house. But at the same time, looking at archaeology under A, and this was one of the first places where we really considered archaeology as an area of significance under criterion A, because these excavations that were involved in the conservation of this building had a lasting impact on the field of historical archaeology as a whole, in the National Park Service specifically, and how we look at the research that's done on historic buildings. And by combining the two of them, we were able to avoid being very repetitive and having separate discussions of archaeology versus architecture versus conservation. And then at the end, we talked about the other areas where the site is significant. There's a nationally significant landscape there for the Park Service. There's other archaeological significance, and prehistoric and historic. And then there's local significance for the architecture of this colonial revival house. By covering all of that together and interweaving them together, I think we were able to explain a very complex resource in a different way, and it sort of informed a lot of what I've done since then, because I realized that the National Register nomination form can be tweaked to allow for all different types of situations. This is Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls in Waterloo, New York. This is a building in Seneca Falls, and this was one of the first Park Service projects I worked on. And there are 4 park units there, and the reason they're all significant is that they're thematically linked by their associations with the early 19th century women's rights movement and the first women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls. Now again, this building, it's not really the building where the convention was held. There are pieces of it. You can see the brickwork, but most of it was reconstructed because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the building was left to fall apart and different things happened to it. Again, this had a complex criterion A statement that discussed a lot of peripheral, maybe on the surface areas of scholarship about abolition and other movements that were going on in New York at the time that the convention was held, but all of it sort of informed the reason for why Seneca Falls, why did these events occur here in this place at this time. And they really helped to add layers to the discussion that may not have been there initially if you just say, well, it's important because of this one event. Now that I did this about 10 years ago, and there's a lot of recent scholarship about the women's rights movement that probably would get added in now if we were to work on writing this National Register nomination, issues of intersectionality and looking at how the abolition movement really worked with the women's rights movement. And I find that having worked on this a while ago and now hearing different perspectives coming into scholarship today, that it's good to always question those narratives and come back to these things writing any National Register narrative and try to think about how to incorporate all pieces of the story. Maybe they're not relevant, but maybe they are if you start digging deeper and think about where the women and the minorities were in the story. And again, the fact that the building itself is a reconstruction, there was some complex justification needed for talking about this building, but by adding in all the layers, you really were able to understand the national significance without having to focus specifically on that architecture. And that kind of leads me into this next one, which is Johnstown Flood National Memorial in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where you go from a building that's partially there, like the Wesleyan Chapel, but to one where the most important resource in this story isn't there at all. And these resources in Johnstown are all associated with the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which formed in 1879 as a resort for Pittsburgh businessmen, and the dam failed infamously on May 31st, 1889, and caused the flood that devastated Johnstown. The resources in the park include a portion of the former lake bed, which you can see at the bottom, where there's a boardwalk you can go out and look, and then a farmhouse that overlooked the property, and then on the left is the National Park Service Visitor Center. And looking at the various areas of significance here, well, why are these resources in particular important? Obviously, the disaster itself was important in American history. Looking at all the different reasons that it was important, and you could consider various areas of significance, including law, for the fact that all the civil suits that were brought to the company and the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club after the disaster ultimately contributed to the idea that companies and property owners can be held liable for this kind of damage. And there's a lot of complex pieces that could have gone into this, but instead we really just focused under social history and told the story under one area of significance and decided all the resources, including the few buildings from the club that were left on the other side of the lake, covered this this discussion. And again, we went with a short period of significance that begins with the organization of the club and the construction of its buildings in 1879 and ends with the flood on 1889. And so that pretty much summarizes why these resources are important. And my last site is one here in Connecticut, Connecticut's National Park, which is Weir Farm National Historic Site. This is in Wilton, Connecticut, and it's a portion of the property owned by an American Impressionist painter, Julian Alden Weir. And its primary significance here is under art and for its associations with Weir and his daughter Dorothy's husband, who became a prominent sculptor as well and lived here. It has significance as a vernacular landscape. The reason I wanted to mention this nomination was because this is where the creative aspect of the form really came into play. And one thing we wanted to emphasize was how important the landscape itself was in inspiring and influencing the career of Weir and others who continue to visit and paint there. And so in the Criterion C discussion for the landscape, we added a lot of images of paintings that were produced based on the paintable landscape that Weir saw where he lived. And so we juxtaposed the actual images of the paintings with current photos of the site. And I think that in the end, if you instead of it just being a pretty vernacular landscape, you can see the important contributions that the landscape made. So that kind of sums up my quick summary of various nominations I worked on.
Okay, good morning, everybody. When I was thinking about this session, the thing that popped into my mind is kind of a struggle that we have in Rhode Island from time to time, where people want to list things under as many criteria as they possibly can. And so I thought that's a good thing to talk about. So here are the criteria, if you don't know them. I'm not going to read them, but the way we kind of break them down informally in the office is A is broad patterns of history, B is people, C is architects and architecture, and D is archaeology. That's the shorthand. But we find a lot of times that people just really want their property to be really, really important. So it could be the best piece of architecture you've got, but they also really want to tell you that the postmaster lived there, and the postmaster was incredibly important to the town. And sometimes that's just not necessary. If there's a tax credit hanging on a property, and the nomination, they really, really, really want to make sure that this is historic, and it's going to go through without a problem, because literally there can be millions of dollars on the line. So they'll throw everything into a nomination sometimes to make sure that it goes through. And that can be a blessing and a curse from time to time. Property only needs to meet one criterion to be listed. It doesn't need to meet 4. It doesn't make any difference if you meet 4, if you meet 1. So you have to figure out and play that game and find out where the line is, where you are not leaving out the obvious, but also not making a stretch and giving the Park Service or the keeper a reason to kick a nomination back to your office to do a rewrite. So how do you decide how many criteria you go for, which one or which ones? I do want to mention that I did some of the field work on that castle in New Hampshire when I was at Cal 20 years ago. So I have a personal investment in that property. So sometimes the right criteria are incredibly obvious, like this example, which is the Anthony Kinney Farm in Narragansett, Rhode Island. eligible under criteria A and C for its agricultural history and for architecture. It's a 149-acre site, was farmed beginning in at least the 18th century, if not the 17th. The bungalow, which is the building, is a pointer on here somewhere. I'm going to press a button and it could all go sideways. Oh, okay, good. The bungalow was built in 1901 as a clubhouse for a planned polo grounds and golf course on the site. So this is the interior. It's been through rehabilitation. You can see in that corner there's a gable. That's the farmhouse. The farmhouse was built after the bungalow. It replaced an earlier farmhouse from 1904. So this one's 1904, and then there's a barn, some of the fields. So this just seemed obvious to us, a continuance of agricultural use on the property. And also, the bungalow is a one-off in Rhode Island, at least surviving-wise. So this is a map of the Nipsachuk, Second Battle of Nipsachuk archaeological site. And obviously, under criterion D, archaeology, this property could, though it has been metal detected to find artifacts and some investigation has happened, there's still more out there, and there's still more that can be learned. It's a very important battle, excuse me, in King Philip's War. It occurred on July 2nd, 1676. And what is shown on the map here is troop movements. This is Connecticut Dragoons and Mohegan and Pequot allies attacking a Narragansett encampment kind of down in the swamp. And all the little dots are artifacts that were found. And the battle was reconstructed based on, we found a whole bunch of shot in this area, so we know that they were shooting at something that was here. And then there's a first-hand account of the battle, so the two things together, and there were horseshoes found and other implements of the battle. All of that together they were able to reconstruct how this battle happened. But there's still more out there to find. A bigger area could be investigated. Clearly a criterion D nomination for us, and also A because of its relevance in King Philip's War. But the one I really want to talk about is the Green Jacket Shoal. This doesn't have a formal name yet because it's still going through the process of nomination. It'll probably be something like the Green Jacket Shoal Maritime Archaeological Site, something like that. Last year we received information from a group of supporters for this site. It's in Upper Narragansett Bay, so this is East Providence, if you're familiar with that. This is Fox Point area of Providence, Providence River, Allen's Avenue. This is Route 195 going from Rhode Island into Massachusetts. And a pretty intensive inventory had been done without any excavation to conclude that a roughly 38-acre site contains the remnants of 29 wooden vessels and a dry dock / pier. Okay, so you see all the vessels on here, and this is the pier. So if we look back at a historic map in 1897, this is 1897's map, the site was a dry dock from 1884, excuse me, under the Providence Dry Dock and Marine Railway Company, and operated up until 1919. Vessels were built here, repaired here, and broken down. So this seemed clear to us under criterion A that it was significant for an industrial use. This is the only example of a 19th century dry dock that we have in Rhode Island. You'll see what it looks like later on now. And it also deals with other areas of industry shown here. Only 2 of the 29 remnant vessels on the site have been identified at this point. The others represent a number of types of vessels that plied the waters of Upper Narragansett Bay and Narragansett Bay as a whole, and the rivers that feed it during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And these vessels were essential to how the economy worked in the state, the northern and southern parts of the state throughout that time period. So again, we were thinking that this is significant for industrial use here and also for transportation, because two identified ships were popular steamers that took people on excursions up and down Narragansett Bay. So for the transportation use of people, the transportation use of goods and industrial, and the pier, this is clearly an A for us. And you might be even able to make a case under a separate area for A of recreation for taking people to different parts of the bay where they would go down to the southern bay to be at the beaches and shore dinner halls and things like that. How that will play out in the end remains to be seen at this point. So the supporters of the nomination have also proposed criterion B, persons significant in our past. My personal feeling on this is a bit of a stretch. And I'm not showing you a picture of a person, and that's kind of why it's a stretch. Criterion B for the naval architect who designed one of the excursion steamers, the Mount Hope, seen here. Another of this naval architect's ships, not this one, was described as the supreme example of American steamboat design at the close of the 19th century. This is what it looks like now. 3 views of the same thing. So here we're talking about a site that's not associated with the life of this person. It's just an example of what he did. And even if it was associated with his life, it's about him being the designer of a ship, and all we have left is the framing below the waterline. It just doesn't seem like the best resource to tag under criterion B. If you had George Washington's actual birthplace, you know, there probably are other sites out there that are more closely associated with this person that are better examples of what he has done, and to make the case for B in this instance. Under criterion C, this is an aerial drone shot of the majority of the site, the bulk of the site. So this is the pier, so land is here. The pier, the dry dock is on this end, and you can see wrecks throughout. They're stacked on top of each other. This is a modern barge that has been removed, or is going to be removed. But they're just kind of all willy-nilly here due to the ship-breaking process. They basically would strip what they wanted off the ship and then just kind of push the rest of it off and leave it there to rot. And so it's doing a great job of rotting in like 2 feet of water at the top of the river. The supporters also proposed criterion C, distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or representing the work of a master. There are multiple types and distinctive methods of construction represented in the vessels that are, the remnants of the vessels that are here in the water. So we're early on still kind of okay with this. We think it needs more investigation. We're not really positive, but you know, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a building guy, so to the archaeologists it probably makes more sense than it does to me. But, okay. They've also opined that the remnant of the steamer represents the work of a master, the guy from B. So, again, making the argument that, making the argument that multiple types and methods of construction are represented by the wrecks, when all we have left is what was below the waterline, has me asking integrity questions as well. I, again, not being an archaeologist, nor a sailor, nor a naval architect, can't tell you what these things look like based on what is left. I can tell you how big they were if I go out and measure them, but that doesn't help me to visualize what was above water or even what was necessarily below water, depending on how much of each is left. But that's where the archaeologists and the ship experts come in. And maybe they can tell us more. Maybe they can't. Maybe there are examples similar to these that are extant or that are well documented, and they can say, oh yes, this is obviously a schooner, barge, whatever, coal hauler, something or other, you know. So this is kind of an up in the air criterion. Also, the statement that this is a work of a master is really, again, not flying with me. I think of it as if falling water is gone and all we have left is the foundation, do we say that that represents the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and is the best example of his mastery of architecture? It's probably a really interesting foundation because of where it is and how it's done, but even that doesn't really give you the full picture. So I have that concern as well. And then under criterion D, what seems like the most obvious to everyone who's ever seen this one, I think, the archaeological criterion, it may yield more important information. Absolutely. I don't doubt that for a second. If archaeological studies are done, maybe consisting of some level of excavation, at minimum, a thorough recordation of everything that's out there, I'm positive we can learn more. So whether that is done as part of a National Register nomination or as part of something else, as an addition to the existing report that's already been done, that remains to be seen. But this seems like a gimme for me. So I would say that the case for listing this site is made just by attempting to list it under D, and you don't really need the rest. But I know a lot of people like to link D to A, so link archaeology to broad patterns of history, and you can probably do that here. It's going to depend on how the process happens, how the consultant looks at the site, what they can present to us at the state for review to make that argument, and whether it is actually worth going down that road if you've already got D. Okay, just nailed that. So that's basically that part. Now, because Ned Connors is sick, and because I worked on most of these projects in some capacity as a reviewer, I will try to do my best to tell you what Ned was going to tell you about his slides. As far as criteria are concerned. So this is the American Brewing Company in Providence, listed on the NR in 2016. Thankfully, he put all these notes on the slide for us all. Under criterion C for local significance. So the bottom left image is what the building once looked like, and the bottom right, the right image is what it looks like now. There were clearly integrity concerns. The roof is obviously gone. It's now a flat roof. Windows are gone. There are remnants of some of the windows, if I recall correctly. But the massing is there. But the important thing, and the reason that this went for criterion C, is the inside plan. So here's a relatively complicated drawing of it. So this is the same angle. So this corner here is this front corner here. The story under criterion C for this, for architecture, was that this building exemplifies the process of how beer was made. By having all these particular rooms, which is not abnormal for any industrial process, but the way that the work flowed from room to room is characterized by the construction. The brew house, for example, the three-story kind of lilac-colored space, has holes in the floor where equipment passed from one level to another during the processing of beer. How the beer was moved through the different processes of production is exemplified by remnants of what's in the building, and this is where Ned could talk at length about the specific things, but it seemed like a bit of a stretch because we had integrity issues, but it seemed like an argument worth making and the best argument to make in this particular case. The other argument is basically criterion A, because beer is important and everybody loves it. And we thought about it. I mean, we talked to the consultant about it, to Ned about it, and it just didn't seem like as good an argument as this. And the industrial people on this one were really like, this is cool. Like, this is a thing. You need to do this. So it got listed for what it was for that particular process. Andrews Mill Company in North Smithfield, this was just listed last year under criterion A and C. So we list criteria A and C, I keep messing it up. We list a lot of industrial sites in Rhode Island. But we have a kind of belief in the office that any industrial site of any scale basically contributed to the economy of how Rhode Island, the main economic activity of Rhode Island in the 19th century and early 20th century. Industrial textiles and machine parts drove Rhode Island's economy throughout that period, and the economy changed when those things left up to the mid-20th century. So we will look favorably on most brick buildings that once housed machinery. And this is one, we got all the really easy ones, like Gorham Manufacturing that made everything silver, and the really big textile plants in Pawtucket and Woonsocket. Those were easy. Those slam dunks, easy nominations. And then so now we're left with things like this, which is marginal, I guess. It's a good way to say it. Ned, being the industrial advocate that he is, loves this property. I think it's okay. Other people also love it. Ned is not the only one. Typical for industrial properties is going for criterion A, again for that economic development aspect of it. And once in a while we throw in C. This one got C because, in my mind, primarily of, this, which is an integrated office on the front of the building. So this is what it looked like in 1918 when it was built. This is what it looks like today. It's got this fantastic aluminum skin on the front of it. But when you remove the aluminum skin, all that original brick is still there. The windows openings are just kind of built down, but they're still there. The trim is still there. But we don't have examples of, or many examples of an integrated office built right onto the front of a building that looks like a separate thing in Rhode Island. So we thought that was an interesting and important aspect of it. And also, you can kind of see in this picture, and if you know what you're looking for, I guess, you can see it there. This has a sawtooth monitor weave shed, which is a particular design, roof design that was used in weave sheds in mostly the 20th century. So it's a character-defining feature of the building. So this one, taking the combination of those two, we went for A and C. But there were definitely arguments in the office for not doing C. Ned also did a nomination for Prospect Heights Housing Project in Pawtucket. This is the earliest housing project in the state. I believe that's at least it's in the top 3, and it has the best integrity of the top 3. I think that's how we ended up. This was another discussion, I guess you could say. So you've got 36, I think, original buildings that are all still there. The layout is still pretty much the same. The roadways have changed a little bit. The buildings have been tweaked. All the roofs, you can see up here, they have gable roofs. They started out, or hip roofs. They started out with flat roofs. It's not as visible in there, but at some point, I guess they had enough problems with the flat roofs that they decided to put hips on. And then the windows obviously have been changed over time. The cabinets in the kitchens have been changed. So there have been some integrity changes, but it's really about the story here. The story of the development of this through a federal program for housing, and there's a National Park Service state context statement for housing that this fit into. Again, Ned would tell you more, but I can't at this point. And then I think this is the last one. Jenks Spinning Company, another industrial property. Hey, it's big, it's brick. It had machines in it. We should list it. A and C, I don't remember what the specific story is. Sorry, here, but it does also have the sawtooth monitor, so you go for C there. It has a good warehouse down at this end. Yeah. Oh, that's it. Okay, so that's Rhode Island.
so we're going to stand up. And I also have a connection to a gas holder house because I live in Troy, New York, and I have one right outside my bedroom window, but it doesn't have a gas holder in it, but it otherwise looks just like that one. So New York's heritage is so rich, and one of our SHPO's highest priorities is to include a greater diversity of historic resources on the National Register. And by diversity, we mean virtually all buildings, districts, and sites that fall outside of the general category of beautiful buildings associated with great white men, which was our priority for the first 30 or 40 years of the program. And we did list the Woodstock Festival site a couple of years ago. Now it's coming on the 50th anniversary of Woodstock this August. These include resources associated with African American history. They include vernacular buildings. They include properties that represent working class history, properties that document ethnic history, and properties associated with LGBT history, among others. When you're talking about resources representing the history of ordinary people, or ordinary architecture, or people whose history wasn't valued, difficult questions can arise about integrity. Resources associated with the more vulnerable are less likely to be attractive, and they are often less likely to be highly intact than those associated with the wealthier classes and the higher styles. So because National Register eligibility requires that a resource be both significant and intact enough to illustrate that significance, sometimes we have to be more thoughtful or even more creative about using the integrity standards. So today, Amanda and I are going to present a case study for a property associated with an important aspect of LGBT history that at first glance presented less integrity than we might have hoped. So first a little background. First a little background. Since 2015, the New York State Historic Preservation Office has received 2 underrepresented property grants from the National Park Service for a project to document LGBT sites in New York City. These grants allowed us to partner with a group of scholars and project manager Amanda Davis, my co-presenter, on an innovative project to prepare a context study, and I happen to have brought 2 copies of that, if anybody wants to. The first 2 interested people can pick them up. Develop a website, do a survey, and produce 7 National Register nominations. This project has greatly exceeded our expectations. The New York SHPO is extremely proud of it, and it's already won 2 major awards. So first, Amanda's going to tell you a little bit about the specific project goals and explain the survey aspect of it.
Okay, so just first off, this is kind of a 2-sentence description of what the project's about. It's the first initiative to document LGBT history in all 5 boroughs of New York City, not just in Manhattan. And the sites illustrate not only the richness of the city's LGBT history specifically, but also the community's influence on New York City and American history and culture. And so essentially we like to say we're putting a rainbow lens on New York City, which is what this photo kind of represents. And so here's our group. One, Andrew Dolkart, standing to my right, actually is a Columbia professor, has written many National Register nominations over the years, including the one for Stonewall in '99. The project was founded through the National Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grants Program, and then with more funding elsewhere. And as I said, we've done a survey of all 5 boroughs, and we make these findings available on an online website for benefit of the public, where we feel this information is really useful and who this should reach. Nominating sites to the National Register, which Kath is going to go over a bit more, educating the public about this history when you don't know about your own history or a history that impacts us all. How can we advocate for them and find them worthy of preservation? And we're also advocating for the protection of these sites, and we recently, the New York City Landmarks Commission is going to be, has just calendared 6 sites for individual designation, which is really exciting. So this is the most visible aspect of the project. This is the homepage of our website, the 5 boroughs of New York City, and we've divided our site types up into these 8 categories that we find show up most frequently. As you can see, Manhattan is kind of overtaken with pins, but it's not to say that there's not more sites in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens. It's just that a lot of the history of the community would go into Manhattan and Greenwich Village, or Harlem specifically. And this is also true of people living in the tri-state area, including Connecticut. Much of this life was happening in the city before going home elsewhere and being more closeted again. And we're looking at sites from the beginning of the city's history in the 17th century, or Western civilization anyway, up until the year 2000. And we looked at, we have it to the year 2000 to include things like the AIDS epidemic, which obviously had a huge impact on the community, but also to acknowledge more diverse community groups and a more open presence that happened after Stonewall, when you start to see signs on buildings. The Gay Activists Alliance, a sign after 1969. You would never have seen that before. It was a much more closeted experience. So looking at places in that way. So with SHPO, we've also undertaken this citywide survey. This is just a sampling of some of the forms that we've submitted, or sites for forms that we've submitted, and we tried to get a diverse array of sites, geographic, ethnic, gender, et cetera. Audre Lorde House on Staten Island, Billy Strayhorn, a jazz musician in Harlem, Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, and so on and so forth. I see a church like Spencer Memorial Church, which was an important gathering space just after Stonewall for gay groups, and works of art like the Walls of Jericho by Harlem Renaissance sculptor named Richmond Barthé, and even something like Reese Beach, which became a popular gathering space beginning in the 1940s. It was a more isolated section of the beach where gay men and lesbians could feel comfortable being together in an era when it was incredibly repressed. So one example that we of these forms is the Gay Activists Alliance Firehouse in Soho. It was actually a city-owned building that the group took over for a period of 4 years. This was one of the most important groups to form right after Stonewall, and it was also a very important community center. Bars and nightlife had been popular places for LGBT people to gather, but not everyone wanted to meet at bars. And this firehouse was incredibly important in providing dances for same-sex couples, movie nights that you could see, movies together, just like really communal things that many of us take for granted. That was really important in those years. So we would list, National Register evaluation. This was under Criterion A for its association with the Gay Activists Alliance, and we feel that it is compelling enough to be significant and under exception G, since it's under 50 years. Although we're coming up on 50 years from 1970, which is kind of crazy. And then areas of significant social history, civil rights.
So how many survey forms have we done, ma'am?
36.
36 survey forms. And so, all right, so this chart shows all of the sites in the country that have been listed for association with LGBT history. And those that are in New York are highlighted, and I'm proud to say that New York leads the nation. And I'm going to show you the ones that we listed through the Underrepresented Communities Grant. So the first one is the Bayard Rustin residence, which is apartment 9J in building 7 of the Penn South complex in Manhattan, and that's Rustin on his terrace. This is the most important residence associated with Bayard Rustin, a gay African-American Quaker civil rights advocate, proponent of nonviolence, and campaigner for social and economic justice. And Rustin was discriminated against for each of those affiliations, but nevertheless he had an important impact on many of the nation's social justice achievements since the 1930s. Among his many accomplishments was planning the 1963 March on Washington, but he was never publicly credited for it by African American leaders because he was gay. The next one was Julius's Bar in Greenwich Village, which was the site of the Sip-In, an important early event in the modern gay civil rights movement. On April 21st, 1966, 3 members of the Mattachine Society walked into Julius's, announced they were homosexual, and asked to be served. Their attempt was to challenge the New York State Liquor Authority, whose regulations prohibited serving drinks to known or suspected homosexuals because they were, by the Liquor Authority's definition, rowdy. The SIP-in generated publicity and resulted in a change to that policy, and it helped to establish bars as central, acceptable social meeting places for gay men and lesbians. Next was the Alice Austin House on Staten Island. Now that was already an NHL for association with the prominent 19th century photographer. However, the nomination did not reveal the full extent of her significance as an artist living in an openly non-traditional life and how she dealt with gender and social norms in her photography. And that is her dark room on the right. Between 1917 and 1945, Austin shared the house with her companion, Gertrude Tate, with whom she had an intimate 53-year relationship. Her non-traditional relationship with Tate and her exploration of gender and social norms were illustrated in her photographs, creating a unique group of transgressive images of life that was out of the ordinary for its time. Although this information was crucial to understanding her work, it was assumed that knowledge of it would damage her reputation, so it was not widely known or publicized. We amended the NR nomination, but not the NHL, because that would have been quite a bit more work, in order to document this missing element in the record of her life. This is Earl Hall at Columbia University, which is significant for its early and noteworthy association with Columbia's LGBT community. Columbia was the first university in the United States to have a gay student group, founded in 1966 and recognized by the university in 1967. Beginning in 1970, the group's successor organization, which also had offices at Earl Hall, began holding monthly gay dances in the auditorium, which is seen at right. These dances grew into one of the most important gay social events in New York and attracted large numbers of LGBT people from all over the city. The James Baldwin residence on Manhattan's Upper West Side is scheduled for our June State Review Board meeting. This house is significant for its association with the prominent American author and activist during the final period of his life, 1965 to 1987, when he owned this house and it served as his primary American residence. As a gay black author, civil rights activist, and social commentator, Baldwin transformed discussions about race and sexuality in America and abroad. He was an ever-present figure in the literary, political, and social circles of his time, and he became the most prominent writer to chronicle and critique the U.S. civil rights movement. Now, if you saw that movie on Baldwin that was out last year, the name of which I just forgot, all of the commentary that he produced that was used in that movie was during this period of his life. And then finally, the Church of the Holy Apostles and Parish House in Greenwich Village was also already listed on the register, but we're adding significance in social history for its early and significant association with important LGBT political, social, and religious organizations founded in the decade after Stonewall. From 1969 to 1972, the church, which welcomed LGBT members, was host to meetings of the West Side Discussion Group, the Gay Liberation Front, and the Gay Activist Alliance. Holy Apostles also provided space for 3 early LGBT religious organizations founded there: the Church of the Beloved Disciple, the Metropolitan Community Church of New York, and Congregation Beth Sinchak Torah, the first permanent LGBT synagogue on the East Coast. So now, this is Cafe Chino, the one we're going to be talking about today, also in Greenwich Village. It's significant in the areas of performing arts and social history as the first venue of importance to stage off-Broadway theater, then a newly emerging movement, and for its role in the development of gay theater and its support of gay playwrights at a time when depicting homosexuality on stage was illegal. So Amanda's going to explain its history and significance.
So you can see it's just a kind of regular tenement building that appears a lot in this neighborhood of Greenwich Village, which was largely Italian in the first half of the 20th century. And that plays a role actually in the Cafe Chino. So this is what it looked like in 1965. We set the period of significance from 1958 to 1968, which was the years of the cafe's operation. It was a cafe theater, the photo on the right actually shows posters of what was being performed inside, but that actually also served to help conceal the plays that were happening inside, because The plays were in themselves could be illegal in that they covered gay content. Not all of them, but and then gay people congregated there. But it was a mixed crowd, racially, and also straight people would go there as well, women. So even though this was largely a gay male meeting space. So this on the left is Joe Chino and the noted playwright Edward Albee. Joe Chino was the owner of the Cafe Chino. He himself was openly gay and from Buffalo, New York. He originally wanted this space to be an art exhibition, for a space for his friends to display their artwork. And very soon after, plays started to take place there. And because gay men were so involved early on with his friends and their interest in the performing arts, it very soon came to be known for its new works, and much of it featuring gay content, although it's important to emphasize that women, mostly I think straight women, felt comfortable here as well, writing about topics that meant something to them, and it was largely white. But you can see that the group here, Maggie Dominic, the woman in the center, she helped us immensely. She kind of became the unofficial historian of Cafe Chino and kept so many records that we reference in writing the nomination. This is a group of playwrights from the Chino in 1965. Two of the things that we wanted to prove, Kath had mentioned, that this was the birthplace of Off-Broadway, which is said all over the place, but you can't just say that without proof, so we have to go find it. So first, this is a little small from the back, but essentially what we needed to do was define what Off-Broadway was. It formed in response to the increased commercialization of Broadway and even Off-Broadway. And they were staged in unconventional places like cafe theaters by emerging theater artists rather than established professionals. And they were performing new American work rather than using pre-existing, largely European works. And the non-commercial aspect of Off-Broadway allowed for experimentation because young artists, there was no pressure to be financially successful. So you could write about things if you're choosing, and if it flopped, it flopped. But it was a great incubator space for new work. And coffee house culture, we really wanted to ground it in Greenwich Village at that time. 1950s coffee house culture, you have the Beats, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, famous, all kinds of artists in these coffee houses. These were cheap places off the beaten path where you could really experiment in all kinds of work in art. Joe Chino wanted that for his own space, and theater obviously became what defined Cafe Chino. We also, in context with other off-Broadway venues, there were a few others at this time that were also notable, so really kind of honing in on why Cafe Chino was the first, which we detail in the nomination. And we also put together a list of significant theater artists who got their start at the Chino, and the names in lavender represent largely gay and bisexual men, who, just to show the impact of the gay male community in the creation of Cafe Chino in off-Broadway. And you can see Bernadette Peters, this is actually where she got her start as a teenager in 1966. So also, secondly, we also wanted to prove that this was a pioneering gay theater venue. We gave a background on how LGBT people had been represented in media and in mainstream theater and film throughout the 20th century. There was really a focus on one-dimensional and negative stereotypes that really drove how society viewed this community and how the community viewed themselves. And so the importance of Cafe Chino to have affirming theater written by gay people, about gay people, for gay people, and how important that was. That's similar for many marginalized communities. This is The Madness of Lady Bright. It became the Chino's biggest hit in 1964, and also dealt explicitly with homosexuality. It was about an aging drag queen. So for it to be popular, but also to have this message, was a really big deal. One of the things we needed to prove was the second point, is that the Cherry Grove Community House and Theater on Fire Island was already listed on the National Register, in part for its significance to the development of early gay theater. So we really needed to, beginning in the 1940s, so we really needed to prove why the Cafe Chino stood on its own, and we go into that for several reasons. Greenwich Village, for one, being the epicenter of gay life in New York City and environs at that time. This was a year-round theater. You could go there. There was you go there for a minimum of $1. You didn't have to pay to get in. There's the cafe menu for a coffee and a pastry. You could see a play. It was open to anyone. You could get there easily by subway. Fire Island was a summer resort for the more wealthy, established. It was harder to get to, and it was more laid-back theater for theater professionals to kind of relax. Where this was very serious. These were artists who really wanted to make it in theater. So these were just some of the points that we hit on. And we focused on the fact that Joe Chino was openly gay and how that is important to the narrative. This is something that's usually held back when we talk about gay history, which is something we wanted to confront. His network of gay friends that I had mentioned earlier, and his encouragement of letting people who came through those doors write about whatever they wanted. And as I said before, this was true of women as well. They felt that they could write about topics of their choosing. It just happened that here, if a gay man wanted to write about something that touched on gay issues, he felt comfortable to write that, and that was important. And then finally, the recollections from gay theater artists and gay audience members that came to the Chino was really vital, and we kind of peppered the nomination with so many really great quotes. These are just two, and they're kind of small, but basically William M. Hoffman on the upper left is one of my favorite quotes that I've ever found doing research. He basically tells you why historic space is so important. And I never would have been a playwright without the Cafe Chino. I never certainly would have written about gay subjects that freely. That was the kind of empowerment that the place gave us. We were no longer victims. So I think really specifically talking to the power of place, he didn't realize he was giving such a great quote to historic preservationists. But walking through the walls and kind of transforming who you are and how you in turn affect that space. And this is just, I won't read the quote, but he went on to become a very important gay rights activist early on after Stonewall. And he talks about as a teenager going to this space and feeling empowered because he was listening to stories that connected with him in a way that he was not hearing from society at large.
So, I should add that Amanda is the author of the nomination, and she did a wonderful job. So here's Cafe Chino then and now. That's the exterior, which you've seen, and here's the interior. And at first glance, well, it doesn't really look much like an avant-garde theater now, does it? So what to do? And we know that in order to be eligible, it has to both be significant and it has to be able to illustrate that significance. So the National Register criteria gives us 7 measures by which to judge integrity: location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And to be eligible, a property must retain 4 of the 7. 2 of the 4 must be feeling and association, while the others should be those that are most important in conveying its significant themes. So if we go back and look at the exterior, certainly Chino retains integrity of location and setting, and its design retains size, scale, massing, form, and materials. The storefront retains the general form and configuration. The paired casements have been replaced with single-pane windows, and the lower parts are now covered in paneling. But since the windows were actually covered to fool the police, perhaps the change in configuration isn't really that important. If you were looking for that coffee house in the village where you could see a play for the price of a pastry in the 1960s, you could pretty much find Chino from the outside. What about the interior? In order to determine whether the space had integrity, we needed to identify those features that were essential to illustrating what happened here. Well, interestingly, in 2014, students at Knox College in Illinois designed and built a replica of Cafe Chino inside their theater department in order to stage 4 of the one-act plays that were originally staged there. So they defined and recreated Cafe Chino as a small 18 by 40 foot space with a storefront, 4 walls, an 8 by 8 stage, and a functional cafe serving coffee and pastries. And here's their replica. And, sorry, what did I do? Okay, sorry. I think they actually did finish the walls, but I don't believe they decorated them. I couldn't find a final picture of it. So I think basically with finished walls, this is their interpretation of Cafe Chino. But to help us evaluate it, Amanda did some research and interviews to determine how the cafe actually looked and functioned during the period of significance.
And so here I am with Maggie Dominic inside the space. This is actually in June. I'm wearing a wool sweater. It's a couple years ago. It's really cold. It's cold summers. So one of the things that she emphasized and that we saw in the research was that the stage was very small and portable. In fact, sometimes she'd point out that it'd be over here, sometimes there'd be no stage at all. So it was a really kind of ephemeral space. The lighting by Johnny Dodd, who's the lighting designer beginning in about 1962, here he is here, really set the mood for the room in that his pinpoint lighting, there was a large emphasis on the stage itself and the rest of the room went dark. And also it was, a new play was staged every week. And so there's a lot of reminiscing from Joe Chino and other playwrights and people who went to the Chino, that the decor would change every single week. So the walls are really just the canvas for the plays. And we kind of used all of this to talk about how the real importance was on the action in the room rather than the decor itself, which really did fall into the background and literally went dark when performance. And this was only used in the evenings for 4 performances, the space.
Okay, so from that research, we learned that off-Broadway theater was characterized by small spaces, small budgets, minimal set design, and intimate audiences. We learned that playwrights often brought their own sets. That's a group of playwrights on the left. That the sets and interior designs were ephemeral, changing with the plays, and that the tables and chairs were pushed aside to accommodate the stage. We learned that the stage itself was not fixed and could be placed anywhere in the room. We also learned the importance of pinpoint lighting, which focused exclusively on the actors and left the rest of the room in darkness. We established that the cafe had a certain aesthetic, but that it was not designed nor fixed in time. When Joe Chino saw it for the first time, he said that he saw a narrow rectangular room with a toilet, a sink, and a fireplace, but that he immediately envisioned the counter and coffee bar that were the cafe's main stationary features. While the posters and beads seen in historic photos did create a bohemian atmosphere, we learned that they changed routinely and were not necessary for the performances because the lights were off. With that information, we can look at the interior again, and we note that the cafe space retains size, shape, volume, openness, and informal character. Although there is evidence of some original finishes, such as the tin ceiling, and we know that the original walls survived behind later wallboard and could be restored, we also know that they are not crucial to understanding the use of the space as a performance venue. The essential features, as the Knox students deduced, were the rectangular space, the small size and volume, the movable stage, and the fact that the theater was an undefined, flexible space. It could be easily manipulated. The audience members were close enough to touch each other, but the spotlights focused their attention entirely on the actors. A playwright could walk into this space tomorrow and stage it for an experimental play. Lights and posters could be hung, but size, volume, and flexibility are the more important features, and those are exactly what survive. If we look at the interior in light of this new knowledge, we can see that it does indeed retain the essential character needed for eligibility, and that's the way we wrote it up in the nomination, and Cafe Chino was listed. And I did bring a copy of it if anybody wants to take it home. So that's our presentation. Thank you.